Korea faced an enemy unlike any it had known, an empire that moved like a storm and struck with the precision of a single mind. The Mongols demanded submission. Goryeo offered defiance. What began as refusal became decades of siege, scorched fields, shattered fortresses, and kingdoms tested beyond endurance. Yet resistance endured on islands, in mountains, and in the stubborn will of a people who refused to kneel. Even when diplomacy replaced arrows, the scars of invasion lingered. The Mongol-Korean struggle revealed a harsh truth of empire. Conquest can break armies, but not always the spirit they fight to subdue. The peninsula slept under a silver mist when the first riders came from the north. From the high passes of the Yalu, the wind carried with it the smell of horse sweat and burned grass, the scent of a world already in motion. In the valleys below, the rice paddies glimmered like scales of a living thing, quiet, orderly, ancient. For generations, Goryeo had believed the rhythms of its land eternal, the sowing and the harvest, the monk's bell at dawn, the call of court officials echoing through Kaesong's tiled corridors. But beyond the northern steppes, a new rhythm was forming, one of hooves, fire, and thunder. Goryeo in the 12th century was a kingdom built on compromise. It had inherited the Confucian administration of China and the Buddhist faith of India, tempered by its own mountains and seasons. The king ruled from Kaesong, yet his voice was often drowned by the whispers of clans whose names carried more weight than his crown. Aristocratic families dominated the bureaucracy, their palaces rising above the city walls like miniature kingdoms of their own. Ministers plotted within painted chambers, while farmers bent beneath the sun, and monks prayed in remote monasteries, where stone Buddhas had long since lost their faces to the rain. Beneath the surface calm, cracks had begun to spread. Decades of privilege had dulled the warrior's edge that once protected the realm. The soldiers who guarded the frontiers were paid in promises, while courtiers in silk debated poetry. Along the northern marches, the Gurchin tribes tested the defenses, probing like fingers searching for weakness. They came in small numbers, raiding villages, carrying off horses and women, then vanishing into the forests. For each raid that went unanswered, confidence drained a little more from the heart of the kingdom. In 1170, that weakness erupted into fury. The soldiers who had guarded Goryeo's borders turned their anger inward, led by generals who had long watched aristocrats grow fat on their labor. The coup swept through Kaesong like a storm. Ministers were dragged from their chambers, their silk robes torn and stained with blood. Temples burned as monks accused of corruption were forced from their sanctuaries. The throne survived, but its power fractured. Kings remained, yet they ruled at the mercy of generals whose loyalty shifted with each new sunrise. For nearly a century, the kingdom moved between strong hands and weak hearts, its fate determined less by divine mandate than by the ambitions of men. Across the steppes, a child named Temujin was growing into legend. The stories of his youth spread like wildfire, how he had been betrayed, enslaved, and had clawed his way back to power with a will forged harder than the iron of his father's sword. The tribes that had warred for generations began to gather beneath his banner, united by his promise of destiny. By the time he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the steppe had become a single organism, its veins filled with riders, its breath the dust of 1,000 hooves. From the walls of Zhongdu to the deserts of Central Asia, the world learned to fear the horizon. The first letters from the Khan reached Goryeo in 1216, polite in form, absolute in tone. They spoke of peace, tribute, and the recognition of heaven's new mandate. The court received them with unease. Some ministers urged compliance, arguing that submission was wisdom when faced with the might of the steppe. Others called for defiance, invoking centuries of independence and the protection of the spirits that watched over the peninsula. The king hesitated, torn between pride and prudence. Envoys were sent north, bearing gifts of silk and gold, but no promises. They returned with demands that were heavier than the tribute they carried. In the mountains, hermits spoke of omens, blood in the moonlight, comets cutting through the night sky like the arrows of heaven. Farmers whispered of strange stars appearing in the north. Merchants traveling through Liaodong brought tales of cities erased, of caravans reduced to ash, of rivers that ran red with the blood of empires. Yet in Kaizong, the court debated etiquette. The sound of flutes drifted through banquet halls as if music could hold back the tide. The Mongol emissaries arrived in 12 and 18, their horses sleek and restless, their eyes dark and unreadable. They bowed to the king, but spoke with the certainty of conquerors. Heaven has one sun, they declared, and the earth has one ruler. The great Khan commands all under heaven. The courtiers smiled through clenched teeth. Gifts were exchanged, feasts held, promises made and quietly broken. The emissaries departed with silks and jade, but without satisfaction. Their message to the Khan would be simple. Goryeo obeys in words, not in deeds. The following years brought a fragile peace, but the air was thick with foreboding. Along the northern borders, frontier garrisons reported the movements of unfamiliar riders, scouts who appeared at dawn and vanished by dusk. Villages burned, their ashes scattered across the snow. Refugees fled southward, their carts creaking beneath the weight of whatever they could carry. The court sent messengers to investigate, but few returned. The rest were found months later, frozen in the mountains, their scrolls still clutched in lifeless hands. Within the palace, factions deepened. The pro-war ministers demanded the mobilization of every able man, insisting that Goryeo's mountains had always shielded its people from foreign conquest. The pro-submission faction, often the wealthiest and most connected, argued that survival required diplomacy, not defiance. Between them stood a weary monarch who saw both wisdom and ruin in their words. Each council session became a battleground of voices. The walls of Kaesong, once adorned with Buddhist sutras, now echoed with threats and accusations. Beyond these debates, the land itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. The monastic bells that once marked the hours of prayer began to toll for war. In the countryside, temples became armories. Monks cast their bronze offerings into the fires to forge arrowheads and blades. Artisans who had once carved statues of the Buddha now fashioned helmets and spears. The songs of the peasants changed, replacing harvest hymns with laments of loss and uncertainty. Goryeo's generals inspected the northern fortresses, their confidence eroded by years of neglect. The walls were cracked, the arsenals half empty, the soldiers underpaid. Yet in their eyes burned a stubborn pride, an unspoken conviction that the peninsula's mountains were themselves fortresses, that no army from the plains could tame them. It was a comforting illusion, one that would cost them dearly. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire moved like a storm system, expanding across the world. From the Caspian to the Pacific, cities fell, walls crumbled, and kings knelt. When the steppes turned their gaze toward Korea, it was not out of wrath, but routine. The great Khan sought obedience, not annihilation. His generals viewed Goryeo as a useful outpost for future wars against the islands beyond the sea, a peninsula that could supply ships, men, and tribute. But when Goryeo hesitated, that patience turned to calculation. Empires, like tempests, do not wait for permission. In 1224, a final embassy rode south. The envoys brought one last decree. The Khan demanded personal submission. The court received them with ceremony and caution. A feast was prepared, golden cups filled, and polite words exchanged. Yet behind the ritual, smiles lay defiance. That night, as the Mongol envoys slept in their quarters, assassins crept through the corridors. By morning, the messengers were dead, their bodies left at the foot of the city gates. The decision had been made, not through official decree, but through the knife's silent verdict. When word reached Karakoram, the Khan's response was as swift as it was inevitable. Riders were dispatched eastward with orders that needed no elaboration. Across the grasslands, drums beat like thunder, echoing from one camp to the next. The names of distant lands were shouted in succession: Khwarazm, Jin, Tangut, and now Goryeo. The storm that had swept across half the world was turning toward the peninsula. In Kayazong, the court braced for retribution, but still hoped for delay. The king ordered prayers at every temple, offerings to every deity who might intervene. Gold Buddhas were carried through the streets, their faces illuminated by thousands of candles as monks chanted for deliverance. Yet the smoke of incense could not hide the smell of fear. The common people began to flee south, carrying children on their backs, abandoning homes that had stood for generations. Roads once lined with traders now echoed only with the shuffle of refugees. By 1231, the horizon itself seemed to change color. Smoke rose beyond the mountains, black against the autumn sky. Reports arrived in fragments. The fortress at Uiju had fallen, the defenders slaughtered, the survivors taken north in chains. Sartak, the Mongol commander, advanced with terrifying precision, his army moving like the tide, steady, unstoppable, indifferent to resistance. Towns that had once taken pride in their ancient walls were reduced to ash within days. The soldiers of Goryeo fought bravely, but without coordination, each fortress acting in isolation, unaware that the others had already fallen. In the capital, chaos reigned. Ministers blamed generals blamed fate. The court debated surrender even as smoke drifted closer. Finally, the king made a desperate decision. If the mainland could not be defended, the sea might yet offer salvation. The royal court, its archives, and its treasures were loaded onto ships that sailed toward the island of Ganghwa, where the tides would serve as moat and shield. It was a bold maneuver, half strategy and half prayer. As the fleet departed, the people watched from the shore, silent beneath the fluttering banners. The sound of oars faded into the mist until only the rhythm of the waves remained. On the mainland, the fires of war spread unchecked. Mongol horsemen rode through the empty streets of Kaesong, their torches reflected in the shattered windows of the royal palace. The capital had fallen without a final defense, its treasures looted, its temples stripped of gold. Yet on Ganghwa Island, the king proclaimed that the dynasty still stood, untaken and unbroken. For the Mongols, this flight was an insult. They had expected surrender, not retreat. Sartak's riders searched the coastlines, burning villages, slaughtering those who refused to reveal the court's refuge. But the island remained beyond their reach, protected by the sea and by the courage of those who refused to yield. The war that began with diplomacy and murder would now enter its long, ruinous phase, a contest of endurance between the empire of the horse and the kingdom of the tide. From the northern mountains to the southern harbors, the land bore the scars of what was to come. The rice fields lay trampled under iron hooves. The monasteries that had once echoed with chanting now stood silent except for the cry of crows. The people learned to live between raids, rebuilding what they could, burying what they could not. Songs were written about the fires that never died, about the mothers who sent their sons to the mountains and never saw them return. Yet even in this hour of despair, something in the spirit of Goryeo refused to vanish. On Ganghwa, the court rebuilt its halls and raised new altars to heaven, proclaiming that the dynasty endured as long as its ruler lived. Monks recorded the chronicles of invasion by candlelight, determined that memory would survive where cities could not. The tide rose and fell around the island's cliffs, as if the sea itself conspired to guard what remained of a battered realm. The storm had arrived, but the storm had not yet passed. Beyond the waves, Sartak's horsemen regrouped for another campaign, and far to the west, the Great Khan marked Korea's defiance on his maps with the same ink he used for fallen empires. The peninsula stood small upon that parchment, fragile as a leaf against the wind, yet still rooted in its mountains. History had turned its gaze upon Goryeo, and the first shadow of the Mongol Empire had crossed its soil. Frost whitened the reeds along the Yalu when Sartak's banners appeared beyond the water. Riders dismounted without words, tested the ice with spear butts, and led their horses across in a line so clean it looked drawn by a scribe's brush. Drums thudded once, twice. Then the sound dissolved into hoofbeats as the vanguard flowed over the frontier like a dark river seeking the sea. At Uiju, the sentries saw dust first, then glitter. Iron scales, bridle rings, arrowheads catching the winter light. Gates closed, and orders snapped along old stone. But the men on the walls heard something they had not heard before. Silence in an army that large. When the first volley sang, and the second answered it perfectly, courage faltered. A covered engine creaked forward, a ram knocked in the rhythm of a carpenter at work, and hinges that had held for a century shivered. By nightfall, smoke trailed eastward along the road, and Sartak's scouts rode on without dismounting. Word outran the horsemen. Villages stacked grain by the highway, in a line of forced generosity, hoping an easy gift might save a roof. Priests lifted sutras from altars and hid them beneath floorboards. Mothers packed millet cakes into sleeves and tied charms to their sons' wrists. In temples tucked under pines, bells struck for noon and kept striking long after the hour, as if a louder prayer could thicken the air between heaven and earth. Sartak's first messengers reached Kaesong in lacquered quiet. They bowed to the throne and set 2 tablets on the mat, one carved with forgiveness, one with fire. Tribute tallied in bolts and ingots, maps to fortress gates, hostages of noble blood. These would purchase peace. Refusal would invite the customary remedy. Ministers read, swallowed, and urged acceptance. Generals listened and tasted iron. The king's eyes moved from one faction to the other, as if searching their faces for a future he could believe in. Delay passed for decision. Couriers went north with the polite assent of a court that had not chosen, while the northern passes kept falling. At Anjou, defenders fired until the bowstrings cut their fingers, and then fought with the broken staves. At Pacheon, a monk struck the temple drum until his hands bled, and the sound of it, courage more than command, held men an hour longer on the shattered wall. When the Mongol ladders came up a third time, they came with shields plated in rawhide wet from the river. Arrows thudded and stuck harmless as reeds. Sartak did what the steppe had taught: move fast, punish sparingly, frighten thoroughly. When a village surrendered its granary and a hostage, he waved the riders on. Where a gate closed late or a magistrate stalled, the torch answered. Columns fanned into the valleys, collecting horses, iron, wine, and men who knew the trails. Behind them, a tidy occupation formed itself. Tallies at crossroads, seals pressed into wax, lists of hay, grain, and cattle. The empire traveled light, but it counted heavily. Kaesong received a second demand, blunter, heavier. Hostages of the royal clan, annual tribute recorded on the skin of a white horse, acceptance of the Great Khan's seal. In council, the arguments grew sharp enough to cut. The pro-war lords spoke of ancestral graves and the shame of giving sons to strangers. The party of submission counted sacks of rice and length of coastline, noting that the living had claims the dead did not. At last, the king rose and spoke a compromise that pleased no one. Tribute now, time afterward. Caravans rattled out from the capital with silks and silver, lacquer and furs. They returned with a silence that told the truth. Gifts had been taken. Submission had not been believed. Sartak's main body crossed the Chongchon when the ice turned black under the first thaw. Kaesong felt it the way a man feels a storm through his joints. Pressure building in the air, a weight in the chest. The mind making lists with frantic care. A plan old as the peninsula was brought forward and polished. If mountains cannot hold, let tides do it. Shipwrights on the Han hammered night and day. Clerks sealed the archives into oilskin. Palace women wrapped lacquer sutra cases in layered silk. Guards carried the spirit tablets of kings down to the quays by torchlight. Before dawn, a flotilla pushed off. War junks, grain barges, fishing craft drafted into destiny, sliding toward Gangwa, where currents ran like braided ropes and mudflats rose to trap any vessel that guessed wrong. On the palace terrace, the last to leave watched the city like a parent watches a sleeping child he cannot carry. Banners lifted and fell. Then mist gathered, the river bent, and Kaesong was lost behind a pale curtain. By noon, the royal umbrella rose above the island's beach, and a new capital stamped itself into wet sand with the tracks of 100 litters. On the mainland, Sartak reached the empty palace and understood the insult. He toured the throne room with his gloves still on, tapped a knuckle against the dragon-carved armrest, and turned to his officers without a change of tone. Columns went out in 9 directions. The order was simple. Strip the body to starve the head. Counties near the capital learned what that meant. Officials were made to kneel in the market square and read the Great Khan's decree aloud. Those who stumbled on the words had their tongues pierced with an awl and were told to try again. Fields were measured with cords, taxes recalculated to Mongol taste, smiths registered, horses branded, ferry landings marked with tall stakes bearing black pennons that snapped in the wind like a warning. Where resistance erupted, a half-dozen arrows from a pine grove, a stubborn mare behind a barred office door. The answer arrived with professional calm. A rope for the door, a fire for the pine grove, and a summons for the next town to watch. Life on Gangwa took shape around wind and tide. Engineers mapped channels the color of tea, noting where the mud glinted and where it swallowed poles to the shoulder. Masons quarried stone from the island's spine and laid it into walls that curved with the hills. The court rehearsed a ritual invented on the run. Receive envoys by sea, send answers by tide, rule a realm you cannot touch with hands. The royal library opened in a hall whose eaves looked over oyster beds. Each dawn, monks carried the Tripitaka blocks outdoors to dry, bowing to wood as if it were a living army. Island time changed men. Soldiers learned to read the skin of the water, the way border scouts read grass. They knew when a ripple was wind and when it was oars. Fishermen became pilots, and pilots became officers. A man who had once baited nets now drew maps with charcoal and reed, teaching generals the sound a shoal makes when it sucks a keel. Women boiled armor thongs in brine to keep them supple. Children counted the bells that marked the tide's turn. At night, when the mainland glowed with sullen fires, a hush settled on Ganghwa, so complete that the cry of a single turn could wake a sleeping barracks. Sartak tried the strait once, testing the water with confiscated boats and men who had perfected courage in deserts rather than seas. The current spat them sideways, and a hidden bar rolled them like dice. Archers in island towers waited until hulls showed their bellies, and then stitched the river with flame. The survivors washed up in the mudflats among reeds taller than a man, where their armor dragged them down, and the tide did the rest. Winter returned like an ally. On the mainland, Mongol camps smoked comfortably, and tribute trains arrived punctual as prayer. In the countryside, grief arranged itself into uses. Monasteries forged arrowheads from bells that had once called to meditation. Abbots laid the blame before heaven and then passed out spears. Villagers took to the hills with short bows and kitchen knives ground to blade honest edges. A monk at Cheoin, too old for war, too stubborn for retreat, turned his temple into a hilltop fortress with a palisade of pines and a gate bound in iron. When Sartak's detachment came to pluck it like an easy fruit, they found the path rigged with rolled stones and the courtyard gridded with pits hidden by brush, and they left a captain under a cairn of their own making. Guju's defenders did the same with different saints and different tricks. A woman famed for her voice stood on the wall and sang commands to imaginary companies outside the gate so convincingly that the besiegers counted shadows as men. When night fell, the garrison slipped out through a postern and struck the siege works from behind, setting the ladders alight with pine tar and laughable courage. Dawn showed two truths at once. The Mongols still owned the field, and the peninsula still possessed a talent for survival. News of such episodes traveled faster than caravans. On Ganghwa, a clerk copying a tax register would hear a whisper, "Cheoin stands. Guju lives." His brush would pause, then resume, steadier. On the mainland, Sartak grunted and nodded. He knew that a campaign is measured in barrels and breath, in the obedience of many more than the bravery of a few. The lists grew longer. The garrisons were fed. The riders were rotated. The empire worked. In Kaesong, emptied, guarded, administered, life began to mimic order. Markets reopened under new rules. Mongol officers bought pears and rice cakes with coins stamped in characters. A local boy traced with a stick until he could draw them from memory. A stable behind the palace filled with steppe horses that tossed their heads at the smell of river wind. At night, the streets lay too quiet, as if every doorway held its breath. In the morning, a new notice would appear on a gate, a levy of timber, a demand for boat builders, a list of names for transport north. The city obeyed, because obedience spared a street from fire, and because the island court's letters, tucked into sleeves, read by lamplight, said simply, "Endure." The King's Island Council learned to legislate in distances. Edicts began with tide tables and ended with taxes. They designated mainland prefects as much by temperament as by rank. A hard man for a hard district, a gentle one where the granaries were empty, a monk where the people had more faith than food. Messengers left at moonrise with waxed packets sealed under twine, then watched the mainland shore like hunters at a blind, choosing the moment when a patrol looked away, when fog stepped between eyes and intentions. Spring of 1232 brought a new turn. A hawk-nosed general from the south provinces, Kim Yun-hu, gathered men who had no patience for waiting out the tide. He moved like a knife at night, in among foragers, across a ford when fog sat low, through a line of unarmored cooks at dawn. He burned a supply corral and vanished, shot a standard-bearer from the shadow of a poplar, and left a knot of captured ponies grazing in a moonlit field as casually as if they had wandered there. Sartak sent 3 detachments to net him and caught only stories. Such resistance did not change the map, but it adjusted the arithmetic. A convoy that needed 50 guards now required 80. A foraging party returned short by 12 and jittery by 20. A road once considered safe by afternoon became a place to ride with arrows already nocked. The Empire could afford the expense. Goryeo could not afford to stop paying it. On Ganghwa, a different war was being waged against doubt. The Queen arranged granaries as carefully as a general arrays spears. The prince practiced drill on a sandy strip where gulls scolded him for stepping into their wind. Scholars recited aloud as they copied, so that each character entered the woodblock by voice as well as blade. When a storm tore tiles from the library roof, monks formed a human chain without thinking, and passed the sutra blocks from shelf to floor, from floor to safety, chanting the Heart Sutra until the rafters stopped complaining. Fishermen slept next to their boats. When the trumpet sounded, they were pilots again, drawing in the river with gestures learned before they knew letters. Envoys still came. A Tangut mediator with tired eyes, a Khitan trader in a fur that remembered better winters, a Jurchen lord whose words stitched caution to ambition. Each advised accommodation, tribute increased, titles adjusted, a hostage sent with silk-gloved dignity. The court bowed, poured tea, and asked the sea its opinion. Twice the answer was a fog that hid the channels, and twice the court postponed a decision as if fog were a sign from heaven instead of weather. Summer turned to a harvest gathered with one eye on the hills. Mainland fields yielded enough to keep the people upright, and the Mongol lists satisfied. When a magistrate undercounted, his wife went to the temple alone and lit candles for 2 men. Her husband living, and the official who would replace him if the lists were wrong. In river towns, shipwrights shaped keels for boats that would serve any master who paid. In the hills, boys learned to string bows with their teeth when their hands were too cold. By the second winter, Sartak had learned the peninsula's 2 central truths. The mountains were taller than they looked from the plain, and the tide was a commander who did not listen. He sent couriers north with a request for boats and engineers who would work the Black River crossings. He sent another to the capital with a report that read like a carpenter's list. What had been built, burned, delivered, promised. He marked down the name of the island as if writing it firmly might drag it closer. Meanwhile, Goryeo learned its own lesson. An army that cannot be beaten in the field may be made to linger. A city that cannot be defended may be emptied and remembered. A realm that cannot hold its land may hold to its name. From Ganghwa's cliffs, the court looked west each dusk, and from the western camps, Sartak's pickets watched the island's lanterns thread the shoreline like cautious stars. Between them lay the strait, black and patient. When spring unfurled again, the peninsula did what it had done for 1,000 springs. Brushed ash off terraces, sowed rice into mud that remembered horses, stacked firewood with the care of men who knew winter would come again. News travelled along the coast in the beaks of cormorants and the mouths of boatmen. New levies in the north. A monastery at Cheoin still ringing its drum. Tax lists in Kaizong written in 2 hands. One stiff and foreign, one quick and local. Every tale held the same refrain. The empire had arrived. The dynasty still breathed, and so the first invasion settled into its shape. mainland ruled by tallies and torchlight, an island that ruled by tide and will. Sartak's officers learned the peninsula's names by taste: Han, Imjin, Geum, while the court learned the empire's rhythms by sound: hoof, drum, seal pressed to wax. Neither side called it stalemate. Each called it policy. The storm had crossed the rivers. It had not taken the throne. That was a detail the great Khan would correct in due time. Or so his commanders believed when they wrote their reports and reached for the next page. The island lights went out one by one at midnight. On the far bank, a Mongol sentry leaned on his spear and listened to the water gnaw the mud. Somewhere inland, a temple bell answered the hour. Between bell and tide, a kingdom learned how to endure. Autumn light settled over Kaesong, like a thin veil when the court returned from Ganghwa. The city had been rebuilt in haste, its wooden beams still smelling of fresh resin, its stonework patched in places where fire had eaten through the old bones of the capital. Yet the people lined the roads regardless, bowing low as the royal procession passed. They had not come to greet a triumphant king. They came to see whether their kingdom still existed at all. Behind the restored palace walls, the throne room felt diminished. Years of exile had hollowed the court's confidence, and the palace air seemed heavy with the memory of those who had failed to protect it. The ministers who entered the hall moved with care, as if the floor might still remember the tread of the Mongol envoys who had dictated its reconstruction. Even the king paused at the foot of the steps leading to his throne, placing a hand on the carved armrest as though reacquainting himself with an old friend changed by war. The first weeks after the return passed in ritual recovery. Registers were rewritten, land surveyed, temples reopened, and markets reassembled beside roads still flecked with ash. But the most crucial task came in the form of a single ceremony: the reception of the imperial envoys who carried the orders that would bind Goryeo to the empire. Their arrival occurred under clouds so low they seemed to press on the palace roof, and the court gathered in silence as the Mongol commanders stepped inside. Their fur-lined coats and hardened expressions contrasted sharply with the delicate robes of the ministers, a visual reminder that the peninsula now lived under two suns, its own and that of the great Khan. The envoys presented their terms with the cool precision of men accustomed to obedience. Tribute would be regular and tallied. Hostages of royal blood would be sent to reside at the Yuan court. Taxes assessed by the empire's scribes would supersede local tradition. And most significant of all, a royal marriage would bind the peninsula to the steppe, weaving the dynasty into a lineage that stretched from the forests of Siberia to the plains of China. For a moment, the chamber held its breath. Then the king nodded. He did not bow. His spine remained straight, but the nod alone acknowledged what the last decades of war had already established. Survival now depended on diplomacy carried out under another empire's gaze. The first hostage taken was a prince barely old enough to ride alone. When he boarded the ship that would take him north, he turned once toward the palace, his expression unreadable. The crowd on the docks watched in near silence, understanding that the boy left not as prisoner alone, but as pledge. His life would measure Goryeo's loyalty. His fate would instruct its future. Meanwhile, the Mongol presence reshaped the mainland city by city. In Kaesong, markets expanded with goods brought by merchants following the imperial caravans, felt rugs from Karakoram, copper bowls etched with steppe patterns, and spices carried through the trade routes of Central Asia. Mongol officials surveyed the storerooms and granaries. recording quantities on wooden tablets that clicked softly as they were handled. They paid for what they requisitioned, yet their presence felt less like partnership and more like occupation through paperwork. Outside the capital, the land changed more drastically. The invasions had emptied villages, and imperial administrators saw opportunity in the vacancy. Families from the north, steppe herders, merchants, soldiers retired from the campaigns, were resettled in districts where the population had thinned to almost nothing. They brought with them new customs, wrestling contests on feast days, tents pitched beside traditional tile-roofed homes, and livestock herded in patterns unfamiliar to local farmers. The blend of cultures was uneasy at first, but necessity softened resistance. Beneath the surface of these changes lay a quiet transformation. Goryeo's aristocratic families, once dominant in court politics, found themselves learning the art of negotiation in a world governed by foreign hierarchy. Their children were sent to study Mongolian language and etiquette. Their estates became required hosts for imperial inspectors. And those who resisted too openly saw their influence erode without a single sword drawn, removed not by battle, but by administrative decree. The turning point in this new relationship arrived with the royal marriage. The chosen bride was a princess of the Yuan court, known for her discipline and her austere dignity. When she arrived in Goryeo, she brought with her a retinue that stretched from the palace gates to the outer roads. Guards in fur-lined armor, attendants carrying lacquered chests, and scribes holding the documents that affirmed the union. The wedding took place beneath lanterns carved with dragons from both realms. Priests chanted, drums marked the ceremony, and when the princess bowed before her new husband, the peninsula felt its future shift. This marriage was not an alliance of affection. It was a declaration sculpted into ritual. Goryeo was now a vassal state in name, in law, and in blood. From that moment on, each king would be bound to the empire through family threads that ran across the Yellow Sea. And yet, within this binding, lay the possibility of survival. Through the princess, the court could petition the empire. Through their children, they could secure favor. Through this fragile, political intimacy, the dynasty could breathe. The marriage also transformed the capital. Mongol ceremonial standards entered the palace grounds. The royal wardrobe expanded to include garments woven in steppe-side looms. Imperial envoys attended court festivals, offering gifts that matched tribute with subtle reminders of hierarchy. During celebrations, the laughter of steppe warriors mixed with the music of Goryeo flutes. Some saw harmony, others saw a shadow. At the same time, the empire drafted the peninsula into its larger ambitions. Craftsmen were ordered to produce ships for campaigns to the east. Blacksmiths hammered steel for armor that would sail under the banners of another realm. Young men from coastal districts were conscripted into work details, shaping planks, bending wood, mending sails. The work consumed entire villages. The sea itself grew noisy, crowded with the shipyards that now lined its harbors. And yet, even under such demands, Goryeo's identity refused to dissolve. Monasteries rebuilt their libraries. Scholars resumed their debates. Poets returned to the capital with scrolls describing mountains they had crossed during years of wandering. Farmers planted in the ashes, coaxing new shoots from soil that had not forgotten its richness. Markets revived. Children played in the streets again. Life in the peninsula adapted, bending without fully breaking. For all the weight of its new obligations, the kingdom found pockets of resilience. Administration improved. Corruption shrank under the watchful bookkeeping of the empire. Roads that had fallen into disrepair were rebuilt to accommodate imperial couriers. In the north, garrisons stabilized under joint oversight. reducing the constant raids that had tormented the region for generations. A fragile peace crept into the land, unfamiliar yet deeply needed. Still, beneath this surface stability remained the quiet anxiety of a kingdom living under borrowed time. Every message from the imperial court carried possibility, reward or reprimand, favor or demand. Every harvest was measured against quotas decreed far beyond the peninsula's mountains. Every year the court watched for signs of the great Khan's shifting priorities, knowing that a change in his gaze could reshape their survival yet again. For now, though, the storms had ceased. The fires of invasion dimmed to embers. The Empire's armies were elsewhere, and Goryeo's role was redefined not by resistance but by endurance. The kingdom had entered an era where survival required a different kind of courage. The courage to live, adapt, and wait for history's next turn. Nothing burned in these years. Not cities, not fortresses. Instead, something subtler smoldered. The quiet determination to remain a kingdom, however small the space allowed to it. The land had bowed, but it had not vanished. Lantern light rippled across Kaezong's palace roofs as a new rhythm settled over the kingdom, one shaped as much by distant steps as by the peninsula's own mountains. Courtiers moved through rebuilt halls, with steps that no longer drifted between panic and defiance, but something closer to careful adjustment. After decades of fire, quiet carried its own unfamiliar weight. Into this hush arrived customs, faces, and commands from the empire that had remade the world. Their influence did not fall by force. It seeped into routines until every chamber of the palace echoed with its presence. Envoys from the Yuan court appeared with a regularity that reshaped daily life. Scrolls inked in 2 languages arrived with instructions, formal greetings, and lists of required tribute. Hostages of royal blood continued their long journeys northward, departing the docks under banners fluttering against the sea wind. They returned grown, fluent in worlds their ancestors had never known, bearing manners learned in cities far beyond the horizon. Each homecoming felt like a reminder that Goryeo's throne now occupied 2 courts simultaneously, one by location, another by obligation. Marriages strengthened these ties further. Princes of Mongol lineage entered Goryeo with retinues of steppe riders, traders from Central Asia, and attendants wrapped in patterned fabrics that dazzled local markets. Their presence altered the city's soundscape. Brass-studded bridles chimed along main roads. Herds of imported horses stamped beside palace walls. Accents from distant deserts mixed with Goryeo's clipped consonants. Change arrived not with armies, now, but on the feet of families. Inside the palace complex, the new queen, raised in the order of the Yuan court, rearranged household structure with a precision few had expected. Granaries were inspected personally. Ledgers were recast in stricter form. Stewards found themselves trained to new expectations, and errors that once slipped easily through aristocratic fingers now left stains on a reputation. Some ministers resisted her influence, though few denied that efficiency sharpened in her presence. Beyond the capital, imperial authority took shape in subtler ways. Census takers began appearing at estate gates, requesting tallies of livestock and harvests, with an exactness that strained Goryeo's traditional record-keeping. Officials dispatched from the north settled disputes that had lingered for generations. Trade routes broadened under coordinated oversight, carrying textiles from Central Asia, medicinal powders from China, and carved goods that introduced new aesthetics to local workshops. Coastal regions felt the empire's reach most intensely. Orders for ship construction pushed southern provinces into an unending rhythm of timber cutting, plank steaming, and hull shaping. Whole communities labored beside the tide from first light until dusk, building vessels destined for the empire's campaign across the sea. Men accustomed to fishing adapted reluctantly to the demands of military shipyards. Exhaustion darkened villages, and the echo of hammers carried farther than sermons or festival drums. Year after year, Goryeo fulfilled these burdens because the alternative remained carved in memory. Resistance had turned valleys to ash. Compliance kept the peace, however strained. When the first invasion fleet departed, the kingdom's coastline thrummed with the grief of families watching sons vanish toward a war not their own. Survivors returned only to begin again. Another order, another fleet, another storm that scattered ships like leaves. This work left deep grooves in the spirit of the land, though it also bound the kingdom ever more tightly to the empire that demanded such sacrifices. Yet influence from the north did not bring only strain. New ideas circulated alongside tribute, astrology practiced by Tangut scholars, instruments fashioned from materials the peninsula had never seen, Buddhist interpretations shaped by journeys across Central Asia. Goryeo's own intellectual world widened, even as its political autonomy narrowed. Scholars trained abroad returned with insights that breathed life into exhausted institutions. Roads improved under shared administration. Frontier raids dwindled. A fragile stability replaced the chaos of earlier decades. Kings born from Mongol princesses brought a different kind of balance. Their fluency in two traditions allowed negotiations that neither side wished to abandon. Through them, the court secured reprieves from excessive tribute, extended deadlines for labor, and opportunities to petition the empire with rare effectiveness. Though sovereignty had thinned, the dynasty learned to maintain a dignified presence within the constraints of a vast political web. Years passed with a cautious calm. Parents taught children to bow before dual emblems on ceremonial banners. Merchants grew skilled at bargaining with northern traders who now walk their streets as neighbors. Monasteries adapted their rituals without surrendering their foundations. Goryeo endured as a realm shaped by its conquerors, yet adorned by its own determination. By the mid-14th century, small tremors began traveling south from the continent. Rumors of unrest in distant provinces spread quietly through merchant caravans. Court envoys reported factions forming in the Yuan hierarchy, each claiming legitimacy, each wary of the other. At first, these were dismissed as court gossip. Later, they carried an unmistakable weight. One felt even before letters arrived with formal updates. Whispered uncertainty drifted through the capital, as those old enough to remember invasion sensed history shifting again. If the shadow that had loomed over Goryeo for nearly a century began to waver, the peninsula would face choices it had not held in generations. The future had not yet changed, but the air tasted of possibility, unsteady, unfamiliar, and sharp as the first breeze after a long and difficult winter. When the winds from the north finally stuttered, people looked upward instinctively, as if expecting the Falcon on the Empire's standard to lift its wings. In that pause between certainty and collapse, Goryeo stood poised, not free, not sovereign, but alive enough to notice the difference. The second invasion began without thunder. No declaration, no royal edict, only dust on the horizon and the muffled hum of thousands of hooves. By the time the watchers on Ganghwa saw the first plumes of smoke rising from the mainland, the Mongols were already deep within the valleys. They came not as strangers, but as tax collectors returning to a field left untended. The first invasion had taught them the geography. The second would teach them how to starve an island. Sartak was gone, but the empire had no shortage of replacements. His successors understood that conquest could not be measured by battles won, for there were few battles left to fight. Instead, they would measure obedience in burnt villages and emptied granaries. They divided the peninsula into parcels of ruin and moved methodically, column by column, valley by valley, until no refuge remained that the empire had not seen. The riders dismounted only long enough to light torches. Monasteries that had withstood the first campaign were stripped of bronze, their statues toppled to feed the forges. Towns surrendered and still burned. The sky itself seemed to darken with soot. In the first winter of 1232, the court on Gangwon learned that the city of Anju had been erased. The messenger who brought the news knelt so long before the throne that his knees bled through his trousers. Behind him stood an orphaned girl clutching a half-burned scroll, the only record of her village's existence. The ministers argued again, voices hoarse from months of repetition. Negotiate, resist, negotiate. The king listened in silence. The tide was out, and the wind carried the scent of smoke from the mainland. No one needed to be told that the war had returned. Kim Yun-hoo, whose name now carried the taste of defiance, gathered what remained of Goryeo's standing army. He was neither young nor patient. His letters to the court were brief. If we cannot protect the earth beneath us, then we have no right to it. He led his troops north, his armor patched and his horse half lame, to the fortress of Cheoin. There, monks joined his soldiers, wielding spears and prayer beads with equal fervor. When the Mongols came, they came in waves, each broken by stone walls and burning oil. Kim's men fought not to win, but to survive the day. When the siege was lifted, the defenders found the monastery roof scorched black and the Buddha within split by an arrow. Yet the temple still stood. The monks said the gods had not abandoned them. The soldiers said the gods had learned to fight. Farther south, at Guju, a single band of farmers and monks held a hilltop fortress against an army that outnumbered them 10-1. Their commander was a priest whose name has been lost to time, remembered only by his title, the guardian of the mountain gate. For weeks they endured, feeding on bark and snow. When the enemy scaled the walls, the priest led a charge with a torch in one hand and a prayer in the other, setting fire to the enemy ladders and dying in the flames. Guju fell, but its story spread like a hymn. Across the ravaged provinces, peasants whispered of the monk who burned brighter than the fortress he defended. Each victory of defiance was answered with 10 acts of punishment. The Mongols did not rage, they administered. They tallied the dead, listed the livestock, and calculated how many more farms needed burning to force compliance. Their commanders were accountants of ruin. They took no pleasure in destruction, they simply recognized its efficiency. When a town resisted, the soldiers marked its name in red ink and moved on. When a town surrendered, they marked it in black and took hostages anyway. By the 4th year of the campaign, the entire peninsula was a ledger of suffering, written in alternating colors of ash. On Gangwon Island, the court governed the smoke. Edicts were issued to regions that no longer existed. Monks carved sutras onto wooden blocks so that words might survive where men did not. Each morning, the king's attendants read reports that arrived already outdated. One fortress lost, another surrounded, a dozen villages vanished. He spoke less and prayed more. The island's temples grew crowded with the voices of the desperate, mothers lighting candles for sons already dead, widows reciting the Heart Sutra with mouths too dry for words. The sea, which had once been the court's protection, became its prison. Every wave that broke against the island carried the echo of things left undone. The Mongols, unable to reach Ganghwa, settled into a rhythm of annihilation. They called it harvesting. Each season had its purpose: sowing fear, reaping tribute, burning what could not be carried away. In spring, they demanded taxes. In summer, they took hostages. In autumn, they collected grain. In winter, they collected bones. And yet, even in this rhythm, Goryeo refused to disappear. The mountains hid survivors who struck at night, vanishing into caves that no cavalry could enter. Whole families became clans of resistance, their lineage traced not through scrolls, but through scars. They called themselves the Forest People, and when they died, their comrades buried them standing upright, so their spirits could continue to watch the roads. By 1235, the Mongols began their third campaign. This time, they brought siege engineers and a calculation sharper than any sword. Their goal was not kaesong, it was exhaustion. The invaders built stockades that grew into cities of leather and felt, complete with markets and tax offices. They raised altars to the eternal sky beside the smouldering ruins of Buddhist temples, and priests from the steppes prayed to Tengri for weather favorable to war. The rivers ran thick with silt, their fish gone, their banks lined with skulls whitened by sun. The chronicles would later write that in those years, even the crows grew silent. Famine followed the armies like a shadow. Fields trampled by horses yielded nothing, and the few that survived were stripped bare by requisition. Families boiled bark and chewed leather. Mothers drowned infants to spare them hunger. A monk wrote in his diary, "The rivers carry both fish and people, and the water knows no difference." The royal court sent grain by sea, but storms scattered the convoys, and pirates took the rest. When the king ordered a prayer for deliverance, the bells of Ganghwa rang until their ropes frayed to threads. The Mongol commanders began sending messages to the island. They no longer demanded tribute, they offered terms. "Submit and rebuild," one letter said. "You have nothing left to lose except the shape of your suffering." The court debated, but pride held firm. Some argued that the sea still guarded them. Others whispered that the sea had merely delayed the inevitable. A younger prince, bold with despair, proposed an alliance with Japan, but his suggestion died on the council floor. The island was safe but irrelevant, and safety without relevance is another kind of death. The fifth invasion arrived in 1254, led by the general Jalatai, whose patience had the edge of cruelty. He marched south, burning what little remained of the countryside, and took more than 100,000 captives. They were driven north in chains to fill the empty lands of the empire, vanishing into steppes where their names turned to dust. A merchant from Gyeongju who escaped captivity wrote later, "We saw the sky once each day, and the whip more often. Those who fell became the earth of another country." The chroniclers called it the year of empty villages. It was said that wolves walked the roads without fear, for no man remained to throw stones at them. And still the war continued, not as conquest, but as habit. The Mongols returned every few years, like a season the land could no longer predict. They burned and withdrew, demanded and departed, each time leaving less for both conqueror and conquered. The land itself seemed to rebel. Rivers changed course, forests withered, salt crept inland from the sea. Monks wrote that the peninsula was purging itself, that the gods had grown tired of both sides. Inside the palace on Ganghwa, time had slowed to ceremony. The royal children grew up without ever setting foot on the mainland. Courtiers wore silk robes, mended so often the patterns no longer matched. The king aged without seeing his own kingdom. At night, when the wind carried the faint glow of fires from across the channel, He would walk the terraces and ask his attendants how many candles still burned in Kaesong. None could answer. In 1258, a rumor spread that the Great Khan's patience had finally run out. A new order arrived in the Mongol camp, the total submission of Goryeo or its eradication. The Mongol general's letter was brief. One sky cannot cover two suns. The council gathered in panic. Some ministers, weary of exile, argued that surrender was no longer shame but necessity. Others swore that as long as the island stood, Goryeo endured. The argument ended not with a vote, but with a knife. The most powerful general in the realm, Choe-Ui, was cut down in his own chamber, his blood soaking the floorboards of a palace he had once ruled in the king's name. His assassination broke the spine of military government and opened the way for negotiation. By the following year, emissaries sailed north to the Mongol camps, carrying white banners and sealed scrolls of submission. The long war of resistance had come to an end, not through defeat, but through exhaustion, too deep to measure. The court agreed to pay tribute, send royal hostages, and return to the mainland. When the first ships left Ganghwa, the islanders watched in silence, unsure whether to feel relief or betrayal. The tide that had once guarded them now carried their rulers away. Kaesong was rebuilt, though it smelled of smoke and bones. New walls rose over the ruins of old temples. Mongol envoys rode through the gates unchallenged. The royal family returned under banners embroidered with the emblems of both kingdoms, the falcon of the steppe beside the dragon of Goryeo. When the king knelt before the imperial envoys, the chronicles say he did so with eyes open and spine straight, as if to show that submission could still resemble dignity. The court wept, but quietly. 30 years of fire had ended. The peninsula was a wasteland that now belonged to peace by compulsion. The rivers ran clean again, but beneath them lay layers of unburied ash. The forests began to grow, though their roots wound around forgotten spears. The Mongols withdrew, leaving behind overseers, marriages, and memories that would not heal. Goryeo remained a kingdom, but one whose heartbeat echoed the empire's will. On Ganghwa, the waves continued to strike the empty docks, whispering to no one. The monks who stayed behind kept the temple bells polished and the records dry. At night, they recited the names of the dead until the stars blurred. One of them wrote in the margin of a surviving chronicle, "We endured because we could not do otherwise. The tide that saved us also took us away from ourselves." Thus ended the age of resistance and began the age of vassalage, a quieter captivity, bound not by chains, but by survival. The fires had burned out, and in their ashes, a different kind of empire took root. What the sword could not conquer, time would. The final years of the invasions unfolded like a landscape stripped of its seasons. Winter and summer offered no contrast, for the land yielded the same harvest in every month. Ash, grief, and long caravans of captives vanishing toward the northern plains. Goryeo had lived through 2 decades of fire, yet even those who had survived the worst believed that the storms of the past could not match what now approached. The empire had grown tired of half measures. Its commanders sought something simpler, something cleaner, an end. In the 5th campaign, Jalayirtai had marched through the peninsula with the certainty of a man repairing a flawed task. Where earlier generals burned out of anger, he burned out of calculation. The empire desired not destruction for its own sake, but obedience. And obedience, in the Mongol imagination, meant removing whatever made resistance possible. Villages emptied not because they were punished, but because their absence left no rebels to feed. Forests burned so that no hill band could hide. Granaries toppled into ravines so that the countryside starved equally, neither peasants nor partisans able to rise again. On Ganghwa Island, the court watched this transformation with dread. Their refuge had kept the dynasty alive, but each report that reached the palace made their safety feel like abandonment. Ministers debated with the desperation of men, aware that arguments had outlived their usefulness. One called for renewed resistance, claiming that Goryeo's mountains had protected its people for centuries. Another insisted that mountains meant nothing when the population beneath them had thinned to shadows. A third pointed out that even Ganghwa's stone walls could not withstand hunger. The king listened and said little. His silence carried the weight of a choice he had postponed for far too long. Meanwhile, the Mongol presence settled over the mainland like a second government. They built their camps into permanent settlements, complete with granaries, tax offices, stables, and shrines to the eternal sky. Their officers married local women, their children born into a world where the word foreign had lost meaning. Horses grazed on land that once belonged to temple estates. Monks who had fled to the hills now found Mongol administrators meditating in their abandoned courtyards, men who spoke little but observed everything. The reign of Goryeo-Yuan, the military dictator who had held effective control for years, began to collapse under the pressure of the war. His personal guard, men hardened by decades of conflict, grew restless. The people whispered that he had brought these disasters upon the realm by provoking the empire, yet he refused any compromise. Even on Ganghwa, where the court led a life defined by tides and silence, Goryeo-Yuan acted as if swords still governed the world. His refusal to negotiate with the Mongols hardened into a doctrine, one that left no space for diplomacy and no future for those who suffered in the mainland's ruins. By the middle of 1258, the realm's patience fractured. Famine had turned villages along the west coast into hollow shells. The young were carried away to serve in distant Mongol territories, and the old died without witnesses. Even loyal retainers began to lose faith. Goryeo-Yuan stood in the audience hall, surrounded by courtiers who bowed but did not meet his eyes. One night, as a storm rolled across the strait and hammered the palace roofs, his assassins came. They entered without ceremony and left without triumph, wiping their blades clean on the sleeves of the robes they had worn to greet him that morning. Goryeo-Yuan's blood soaked the wooden floorboards, and with him fell the last barrier between the court and negotiation. When the king was informed of the assassination, he remained still for a long moment. Then he ordered the council to convene. No one spoke of victory. No one invoked pride. The ministers who once argued for resistance now spoke in subdued tones about the lives that might still be saved. One elderly courtier, his voice as thin as reed paper, said that surviving was not dishonor, but duty. The king nodded. The decision had finally been made, not through strength, but through the exhaustion of the land and the collapse of the government that had claimed to defend it. Envoys were chosen with the solemnity of funeral attendants. They sailed from Ganghwa before dawn, the tide low beneath their hulls, carrying white banners and tablets of submission. The sea that had once served as the kingdom's armor now bore the instruments of its surrender. When the ships appeared along the mainland's muddy banks, Mongol officers recorded the time of arrival and the number of attendants, noting even the weave of the garments worn by the envoys. Nothing escaped the empire's accounting. Negotiations lasted weeks. The Mongols demanded hostages from the royal bloodline, annual tribute in grain and gold, and the relocation of the capital from the island back to the mainland. The court protested only lightly. They knew the penalties of defiance. Every delay had already been paid for in lives. When the final terms were recited, each condition matched a decade of destruction. Submission was not a single gesture, but the cumulative weight of everything Goryeo had already lost. The return to the mainland was carried out like a ritual. The island prepared the court's departure with a grief that resembled ceremony. Temple bells were struck one last time. The monks who remained bowed to the queen's litter and whispered blessings. Fishermen lined the shore with their boats turned upside down, a gesture older than memory, meant to shield departing souls from ill winds. The royal family boarded their vessels in silence, stepping from the island's pebbled sand as if stepping away from a memory too fragile to keep. Kaesong awaited their return like a wounded animal. The streets were filled with mud and ash. The walls had been patched with timber where stone had fallen. Few houses had intact roofs. But people gathered along the roadsides anyway, eager for a symbol that the years of ruin had not erased their kingdom. When the king entered the rebuilt palace, he paused at the threshold and bowed once, not to the Mongols, not to his ministers, but to the city itself. The gesture was simple, steeped in sorrow, and every observer felt its meaning. The dynasty had survived, but the land beneath it had changed beyond recognition. Mongol envoys oversaw the resettlement with calm authority. They entered the throne hall with scrolls, marked each concession in ink, and reported compliance to their commanders. Behind them, the court resumed its motions. Clerks set up writing desks in rooms whose walls still bore smoke marks. Guards stood watch beside gates that had been newly reinforced, and musicians rehearsed ceremonies that had not been performed in 20 years. Life returned awkwardly, like a limb awakened from numbness, tingling with pain but determined to move. The kingdom was intact, but its spirit felt brittle. Farmers returned to fields grown wild and found the bones of strangers tangled in their irrigation ditches. Monasteries reopened with novices too young to remember their founders. Merchants rebuilt their stalls beside roads where the milestones had been shattered beyond recognition. Everywhere, the past was visible just below the surface, like embers beneath ash. Yet amid the devastation, there was a strange sense of clarity. The people had survived the impossible. Entire regions had been erased, yet families traced new beginnings among the wreckage. Temples began carving new statues to replace those destroyed. Women gathered scraps of silk into patchwork garments to clothe their children. Farmers saved seeds from the few surviving crops. Monks recopied texts whose originals had been burned in earlier campaigns. Life, though wounded, refused to soften into surrender. And so, the war ended without triumph, without final battle, without the clang of swords or the ringing of gongs. It ended with a quiet nod, a set of signatures, and the long exhale of a nation that had been holding its breath for 30 years. The peninsula exhaled smoke and grief, but also something smaller, harder to describe, a fragile, stubborn ember of continuity. The Mongol Empire had conquered the land, but beneath the surface of obedience, the pulse of Goryeo still beat. It was faint, but it endured. The sound of axes became the heartbeat of the southern coast. Dawn after dawn, before the mist had lifted from the inlets, laborers stepped onto muddy ground and raised their blades into the shadows of felled forest giants. Timber that had grown for centuries came down in days, trunks splitting like thunder, branches showering carpenters with leaves wet from the night's breath. Along riverbanks and tidal flats, piles of wood rose higher than the roofs of nearby villages. A new kind of mountain, born not of the land, but of imperial command. Shipwrights moved among them, like priests officiating at a ritual. They tested planks with knuckles, bent hull ribs over steaming pits, and fitted joints with the accuracy of surgeons. The Empire had demanded ships, not a handful, not dozens, but a fleet that could darken the sea between the peninsula and the islands beyond. Goryeo's southern villages transformed into construction grounds, where smoke from pitch fires drifted over paddies, and tools hammered the rhythm of obligation into the coastline. Families watched sons vanish into these shipyards as though swallowed by another world. Men, accustomed to nets and salt spray, now lived by the arc of the adze. Farmers turned boat haulers. Fishermen became rope braiders. Even monks contributed, carrying lumber or sharpening blades until their palms blistered. Imperial inspectors walked among the workers with ledgers, marking progress in neat rows of characters that never accounted for exhaustion. Kaesong felt the pressure of this transformation through its couriers. Dispatches arrived twice a week, detailing shortages of nails, resins, and labor. Grain meant for coastal districts dwindled as fields went untended. The court adjusted rations, redirected caravans, and sent messages of encouragement that could not soften the reality. Every plank, shaped for an imperial hull, was one less roof beam for a family's home. Amid this strain, a new presence settled into the peninsula's ports. Mongol commanders, stern, wrapped in layers of fur-lined leather, arrived to oversee the mobilization. They inspected troops, weighed supplies, and studied the tides with a narrowed focus that left little room for courtesy. Unlike the envoys who visited the court, these officers lived close to the soldiers and the shoreline, eating salted fish beside Goryeo generals and discussing wind patterns with local pilots whose families had known every channel and hidden shoal for generations. Those pilots were indispensable. Though the Empire commanded vast land armies, the sea remained an unfamiliar adversary. Goryeo's sailors had grown up with its moods, predicting storms by the movement of clouds or the scent of the tide. Many served reluctantly, aware that the ships they guided would carry men to a war whose purpose belonged to a distant throne. Their expertise could not be refused, yet each instruction they gave felt like another stone laid on their conscience. Along the coasts, camps multiplied. Tents stretched in rows across fields where barley should have ripened. Horses occupied terraces carved hastily into hillsides. Scribes recorded the names of each soldier, tallying every spear and each leather pouch of dried fish. Armorers set up forges near the water's edge, their fires casting tall shadows on the sand as they shaped helmets and arrowheads meant for battles far from home. As autumn approached, the muster grew complete. Hundreds of ships rocked gently in the harbour waters, flat-bottomed transports, deep-bellied supply barges, sleek vessels built for quick manoeuvres. Their hulls bore the scent of newly cut pine and the sheen of fresh resin. Flags embroidered with imperial symbols fluttered above them. Beneath these banners, Goryeo troops stood in formation beside Mongol cavalry, the two forces visible in the mingled designs of their armor. Lamella plates for one, lacquered shields for the other. When the order to depart arrived, the harbor thickened with drums and horn calls. Families crowded along the shore, some waving, some silent. Mothers pressed rice cakes into their sons' hands. Sisters knotted lucky charms around armor straps. Children clung to fathers whose faces were already pointed toward the sea. For many, this journey would be their first beyond the peninsula. For some, it would be their last sight of home. The fleet moved out when the tide turned. Ships pulled away from the docks, with oars dipping in exact rhythm, one vessel after the next, until the waters frothed in their wake. The coastline receded slowly, then all at once, giving way to open water, where the air tasted of salt sharper than sadness. Drums faded into distance, voices blended with the wind. Soon the only sound was the creaking of hulls and the slap of waves against wood. Days on the water blurred into a strange mixture of discipline and monotony. Soldiers cleaned their weapons, practiced archery, or sat in circles recounting stories to stave off fear. Goryeo sailors traced constellations with quiet confidence. Mongol commanders walked the decks with deliberate steps, studying the horizon with eyes more accustomed to plains than to moving water. In the evenings, when lanterns flickered in the rigging, conversations drifted between languages, orders translated by officers, gossip shared in half-understood phrases, reassurance offered through gestures older than any empire. Though they belonged to different worlds, the men aboard those ships shared the same uncertain future. The islands appeared first as dark shapes on the horizon. Patrol boats went ahead, guided by local pilots who knew where currents twisted unkindly. Soon the fleet gathered in a crescent near the shore, sails lowered, oars readied. On board, the soldiers tightened their armor straps. Archers checked bowstrings. The air held the sharp scent of anticipation. A signal banner rose above the flagship. Disembark. Transport surged toward the beach. Goryeo troops splashed into waist-deep water, spears raised. Mongol archers leapt from hulls while holding bows high above their heads. Sand shifted under their feet as they formed into lines and pushed inland. The first defenders met them with fierce resistance, but numbers and momentum favored the invaders. Skirmishes erupted along forest edges, steel clashing under canopies of maple leaves, each battle small but desperate. Tsushima fell. Smoke curled into the weathered sky as supplies were gathered and losses counted. Soldiers rested only briefly before the order came to move again. Iki Island rose from the water like a silent warning. Its defenders fought from cliffs and hidden paths, but the fleet's strength overwhelmed them. Once more the invaders pressed forward, driven by imperial command and tides that waited for no hesitation. Hakata Bay lay ahead, a broad expanse of coastline lined with wooden palisades. Goryeo's carpenters recognized the fortifications. The Japanese had learned from raiders past. Yet the fleet pressed on. Arrow volleys rose and fell like storms of black feathers. Siege engines clattered into action. The bay filled with the noise of war, the kind that reverberated through the ribs of every ship and every man aboard. Goryeo troops fought under the gaze of foreign commanders, but carried memories of their own ruined homeland. Each clash of blades was a reminder of fields burned during the invasions. Some fought in grim silence. Others shouted to drown the sound of their thoughts. They struck the enemy in coordinated waves, pushing deeper into the defensive lines. Yet the landing stalled. Resistance stiffened. Japanese fighters used the terrain with expertise that turned forests into traps and hills into strongholds. Night arrived with rain. Lanterns bobbed on the water as sailors tended to wounded men whose armor lay in pieces beside them. Commanders met on the flagship, arguing strategies in tense murmurs. Reports came of mounting casualties, supply shortages, and enemy reinforcements. The Empire's first great attempt to cross these seas teetered between advance and retreat. Then the wind shifted. Clouds thickened into a wall of darkness. Waves slapped harder against the hulls. A sudden squall blew across the bay, scattering torches and tearing banners. Within hours, the storm swallowed the fleet. Ships crashed together in the chaos. Oars splintered. Sailcloth snapped like bone breaking under strain. Soldiers unable to swim clung to planks, calling out names swallowed by the wind. Those who reached the shore found themselves stranded, their vessels shattered, their formations undone. Retreat became an improvisation. Survivors gathered on makeshift rafts, or followed the coast until they could signal remaining ships. When the sea finally calmed, the fleet was gone, scattered across distances too far to measure. Some sunk, others drifting beyond reach. A few battered vessels limped back toward the peninsula. Their decks were quiet except for the groans of wounded men and the creak of damaged frames. Sailors steered by instinct and memory, guiding the survivors through waters that felt harsher than before. As the coastline came into view, villages emerged from the mist, small, unchanged, and waiting. Fishermen stared from their boats. Families waited at the shore with hope held tightly as if it might shatter. When the survivors disembarked, the silence around them felt deeper than grief. People counted faces. Some recognized loved ones. Many did not. The court in Kaesong received the news in fragments carried by exhausted couriers. The fleet had failed. Storms had drowned the campaign. Men trained for the Empire's ambitions were gone. Timber forests lay bare, fields neglected, and the southern districts echoed with mourning. Still, the peninsula had no say in how the next chapter would unfold. New orders soon arrived from the Empire. Prepare again. Rebuild. Expand. Another invasion was coming, and Goryeo, caught between the tides and the orders of a distant throne, braced itself for another year of sacrifice. Rain swept across the southern coast for days before the new command arrived. Villagers said the weather sensed what humans could not yet name. Another fleet was coming, larger than anything the Empire had ever ordered from the peninsula. Messengers galloped into Kaesong through mud-splattered gates, their scrolls sealed with imperial lacquer. Courtiers read the decree in uneasy silence. Another expedition, greater than the last, and this time divided into two massive forces that would converge upon the islands like twin tides. No one in the court dared question the command. They only set to work. Coastal officials returned to their districts with faces drawn tight from sleepless nights. Forests already thinned by the previous campaign were mapped again. New groves, some barely matured, were marked for cutting. Woodcutters groaned at the thought. Their axes had barely healed from the last season. Yet dawn after dawn, they walked into groves perfumed with resin and swung their blades until sap stained their sleeves. Across the southern inlets, shipyards revived before the previous scars had faded. Fires returned to the steaming pits. Hammers struck iron. The scent of pitch drifted through villages once more. On certain days, smoke rose so thickly it drifted inland like a low-moving fog. Entire ridges were stripped for timber. Even deadfalls were gathered, shaped, and pressed into use. Children watched from doorways as adults labored with the resigned endurance of people who knew refusal would bring consequences they had already lived through once. At the same time, imperial officers arrived in greater numbers. They brought engineers from the northern provinces, specialists in siegecraft and naval logistics. These men surveyed the shoreline with unblinking focus. Their presence reminded everyone that the new undertaking dwarfed the previous fleet. It would not be a single armada. It would be an arm of the Empire stretching across the sea. Villages along the rivers fed workers with whatever they could spare. Bags of millet passed hand to hand. Fish were dried in long strands and carried to shipyards where cooks boiled cauldrons, large enough to feed 100 men at once. Women organized food lines with practiced coordination. They had done this all before. Some carried infants on their backs while portioning out rations. Others sharpened blades, wove baskets, or patched armor. Each task woven into the fabric of their lives like thread in a tapestry that could not be torn without unraveling everything. Meanwhile, troops assembled in camps so immense they appeared from afar like foreign cities. These were not only Goryeo soldiers, mounted men from the steppe, infantry from northern prefectures, and engineers from lands whose names the local workers had never heard, marched beneath imperial banners. Their tents lined the coast in disciplined rows. Their horses churned the beaches into a mixture of sand and churned clay. At night, when fires glowed across these camps, the entire shoreline shimmered as if ringed by stars fallen to earth. Pilots from Goryeo's coastal clans became the empire's most precious resource. They knew the currents, the hidden shoals, and the storms that rose without warning. Officers treated them with a careful balance of respect and suspicion. Navigational knowledge meant life or death. In private, some pilots argued among themselves. Should they guide faithfully? Should they mislead the enemy of a neighbor? Should they try to strike a balance that preserved their honor but spared their homeland? None found an answer that satisfied the conscience. Eventually, the preparations ended with a silence more unsettling than the noise that had preceded them. On the morning the Eastern Route army gathered, a pale mist draped the harbor. Through it, rows of ships emerged, transports broad as floating villages, supply vessels stacked with grain and water jars, and lighter craft meant for swift landings. Their combined mass darkened the surface of the water. People watching from the hills felt their breath catch. This was not a fleet, it was a moving shoreline. Ceremonies took place at sea before sunrise. Drums boomed across the still water. Archers fired arrows tipped with prayer slips. Commanders touched their foreheads to the decks in a gesture that merged gratitude and resolve. Once the rituals ended, a horn cry rolled across the harbor, and the ships began their slow, majestic advance. Progress towards Tsushima felt almost ceremonial after such preparation. The first island appeared through thinning mist, like a stone rising from the ocean floor. Landings commenced in well-practiced precision, with troops disembarking in staggered lines. Resistance emerged immediately, shouts from forested ridges, arrows streaking from hidden paths, defenders rushing from trenches cut into the sandy shore. Each clash pushed Goryeo and Mongol soldiers deeper into unfamiliar ground. Yet the sheer number of invaders forced a slow but relentless advance. Iki Island followed, and again the defenders resisted with an intensity that carved itself into the memories of those who fought. Forest ambushes, narrow paths, and sudden charges marked every hour. Supply officers counted losses with increasing worry. Still, the fleet pressed onward, driven by imperial command and by the belief that overwhelming numbers would eventually settle the outcome. Weeks later, the fleet sighted Kyushu's broad coastline. Hakata Bay shimmered in the summer heat. Defensive walls, rebuilt since the previous invasion, stretched openly along the shore. Smoke rose from signal fires. Drums echoed from hidden positions inland. This time, the peninsula's troops knew they faced a prepared enemy. Disembarkation unfolded in controlled chaos. Arrows flew in dense volleys. Warriors charged into shallow waters with shields raised. Engineers attempted to deploy siege engines, their efforts disrupted by defenders who launched fire arrows and rolled flaming timbers from the fortified embankments. A battle that was meant to be swift turned into a grinding struggle. Soldiers fought on slippery, blood-soaked sands, unable to gain the foothold needed for a breakthrough. Amid this disorder, nature intervened. A wind that had begun as a steady breeze shifted into something sharper. Distant clouds darkened to a purplish grey. Experienced sailors exchanged glances. They had seen this pattern before. Officers signaled for ships to spread anchor lines. Carpentry crews scrambled to reinforce masts already creaking under rising gusts. Men on deck tightened ropes with hands slick from sweat and sea spray. Within hours, the bay erupted into chaos. Waves rose like walls. Rain fell in sheets so dense that visibility shrank to arm's length. Ships collided, their hulls smashing together with sickening force. Some vessels snapped anchor lines and lurched violently into others. Masts toppled, crushing anyone too slow to move. Sailcloth tore apart with sounds like screams. Commanders shouted orders no one could hear. A few soldiers managed to leap toward the shore, only to be swept sideways by waves that dragged them into deeper water. Others clung to floating debris, shields, planks, broken oars, while praying to survive a sea that seemed determined to erase them. Those who attempted to reach safety found themselves slammed against rocks or pulled into undertows that twisted their limbs like strands of rope. Night brought little reprieve. Lightning illuminated a battlefield transformed into a graveyard of wood and iron. Each flash revealed bodies drifting beside shattered boats, armor glinting in the pale glare. Men who had survived dozens of land battles found themselves helpless before the sea's fury. By morning, the storm subsided, yet the coastline bore witness to devastation unlike any campaign. Wreckage littered the beaches for miles. Broken hulls, abandoned supplies, weapons half buried in wet sand. Survivors stumbled ashore in small groups, shivering from cold and shock. Their voices were hoarse from shouting for comrades who had disappeared beneath the waves. Goryeo pilots and sailors, shaken to their core, guided the remnants of the fleet toward home. Their journey back was slow, each day filled with the grim task of accounting for the dead. On board, silence replaced the battlefield chants that had once filled these decks. Soldiers sat with blank expressions, too tired to grieve. Every creak of the hull sounded like a memory returning unexpectedly. As the peninsula came into view, families gathered again along the beaches. They counted figures disembarking. They searched faces for signs of recognition. Some wept with relief. Others fell silent as absence settled upon them like a second tide. Couriers departed immediately for Kaesong, bearing reports written with trembling hands. When the king received the news, he closed his eyes for a long moment. Ministers stood around him, uncertain whether to speak. The cost of obedience had been paid once more, this time not in scorched earth, but in drowned suns. Life along the coast changed after that. Shipyards fell quiet. Tools dulled. Forests lay bare and exhausted. In villages once filled with workers, silence settled like dust. No one wished to rebuild immediately. Everyone knew new commands might arrive, yet hope settled in the spaces where exhaustion left room. Perhaps this would be the last. Years would pass before certainty replaced fear. Losses from the storm traveled through the peninsula like aftershocks. Coastal elders recounted stories of entire fishing communities whose men had never returned. Local temples held ceremonies that stretched deep into the night. Families offered rice, incense, and prayers to the sea in hopes that the restless dead might find peace. Through it all, the kingdom moved quietly under the empire's shadow, hoping the horizon would remain empty, at least long enough for forests to regrow, fields to recover, and the memory of the storms to soften. Wind swept down from the northern plains, carrying dust the color of fading gold. To those who lived near Goryeo's border, this dust had long signaled the presence of imperial caravans or patrols. Yet as the 14th century deepened, it began to drift south in odd intervals, too frequent some months, absent in others, as if the land beyond the Yalu itself breathed unevenly. Those who watched the horizon closely sensed that something vast was shifting in the world above them. The first hints reached Kaesong by way of merchants. They whispered of unrest in the provinces of the Yuan, of tax uprisings that flared like brush fires before disappearing again. Scribes and officials, once rigid in loyalty, were reported to be choosing sides in disputes that grew more violent every season. Some spoke of famine along the Yellow River. Others mentioned armies marching without imperial sanction. The court listened in wary silence. Empires did not collapse in a single year. They unraveled thread by careful thread. Inside Kaesong's palace, the king's advisors debated these rumors in hushed tones. None dared speak openly, not when the empire's envoys still visited monthly. Those envoys arrived with the same elaborate ceremony as always. Drums at the gate, translators flanking them, gifts offered in lacquered chests. They delivered commands with measured politeness, but their eyes betrayed fatigue. Their journeys had grown longer and more perilous. Roads they once traveled with confidence were now flanked by bandit camps or rebel militias. What should have taken weeks took months. Letters from the royal hostages living at the Yuan court painted an even clearer picture. Their messages were careful, written with the restraint expected of family bound to two realms. Yet a tone of unease crept into their phrasing. Court factions forming, ministers falling from favor overnight, military officers jostling for power in the shadows. Even the imperial capital itself, once a beacon of discipline, seemed frayed at the edges. For Goryeo, these tremors stirred a mix of hope and fear. Hope because weakening power in the empire might loosen the grip that had shaped generations. Fear because a collapsing sky could crush what lay beneath it. In the northern districts, Jurchen tribes tested border garrisons with renewed confidence. They moved like hunters returning to familiar trails, sensing the absence of the heavy imperial hand that once pushed them back. Frontier troops of Goryeo, long accustomed to joint patrols with UN detachments, now found themselves alone more often. Posts that once flew both banners flew only one. This solitude brought pride, but also unease. Isolation meant freedom. Isolation also meant vulnerability. General Goryeo-Yuan emerged in this climate. His name traveled quickly through the ranks, steady, disciplined, incorruptible. He had risen in a world where loyalty was tested more frequently than courage. Soldiers trusted him because he wasted no words and expected no flattery. When he walked the ramparts of northern fortresses, men straightened instinctively, as though bracing against a cold wind. He was known to sleep in armor, to eat with the troops, and to speak to common scouts with the respect usually reserved for aristocrats. Under his command, the northern frontier tightened. Outposts were repaired. Watchtowers received fresh timbers. Patrols increased. Yet even as he strengthened the borders, he measured every decision against the knowledge that the empire, overshadowing them, was no longer the unshakable force it had once been. Goryeo-Yuan understood better than most that the balance of the peninsula depended on reading the world clearly and acting before events forced his hand. By the mid-century, the tremors in the Yuan court became impossible to ignore. Letters arrived irregularly. Imperial decrees contradicted each other. One month demanded new tribute. Another rescinded the order. Successions turned violent. Civil administrators argued with generals, while rebels seized entire provinces. The once unified empire began to fracture. Goryeo's court observed this fragmentation with guarded curiosity. When an envoy from the north arrived with an edict written in hurried calligraphy, ministers whispered that the empire was losing scribes faster than it could replace them. When another envoy requested reinforcements, only weeks after a different one ordered troop reductions, the council exchanged glances that revealed unspoken thoughts. The empire no longer knew itself. Amid this uncertainty, a new figure rose within the Goryeo court. Yiseong-gae, a young commander whose talents became evident with startling speed. Born from a family of skilled warriors, he possessed a clarity of judgment that made seasoned generals pause. While Choe-yong embodied steadfastness, Yiseong-gae embodied adaptability. He could read the weather of politics as easily as the wind of the northern steppe. Their first meeting took place atop a wall overlooking a cold river. Choe-yong watched the young man approach, noting the lack of ornament on his armor, the focus in his eyes. Yi bowed with disciplined respect. They spoke of border conditions, enemy movements, and the state of the empire. Both understood without stating it outright. Goryeo needed to rethink its place beneath a faltering sky. The kingdom began distancing itself from certain imperial demands. Where once every order had been met with immediate compliance, now negotiations lengthened. Requests for aid were met with tactful excuses. Flooded roads, sickness among workers, shortages of grain. Tribute shipments grew smaller. Inspectors from the north found delays at every port. Subtle resistance became the strategy of a realm that had survived nearly a century of domination. Still, caution guided every step. Goryeo could not turn openly against the empire, not when its power, though weakened, remained immense. Instead, the court invested quietly in its own strength. Armories rebuilt their reserves. Cavalry units received new horses bred locally rather than imported from the steppe. Fortresses long neglected during years of vassalage were reinforced. The kingdom prepared for a world in which it might soon have to stand alone. Meanwhile, monks and scholars observed the changing era with poetic clarity. Some wrote that the empire resembled a mighty tree whose branches had grown too heavy for its trunk. Others spoke of destiny's river carving new paths. The Tripitaka woodblocks were maintained with renewed devotion, as if preserving the words of wisdom might anchor the shifting world. The countryside reflected this tension. Trade continued, but with interruptions. Markets bustled one month and fell silent the next. Travelers reported that the northern roads were lined with abandoned outposts and emptied villages. Refugees arrived from the continent, men, women, and children, fleeing the turmoil of their own lands. They brought stories of battles between imperial generals, of famines worsened by political chaos, of cities where the emperor's laws no longer reached. By the 1360s, rebellions in China surged like waves against a weakening cliff. Rumors spread that a new force, the Ming, was rising. Some described them as righteous uprising, others as opportunists filling a vacuum. The truth mattered less than the implication. The empire that had once conquered half the known world was losing its grip. For Goryeo, this shift carried enormous risk. Should the empire collapse entirely, the peninsula might become a battlefield for competing powers. Should it survive partially, it might lash out at perceived disloyalty. The kingdom needed strategy, not sentiment. Choe-yong urged preparedness. He argued that only a unified government could navigate the storm to come. Yiseong-gae, meanwhile, urged flexibility. Alliances, diplomatic recalibration, and cautious friendship with the rising Ming. Their perspectives diverged, but their goals aligned. Preserve the realm and prevent it from being swallowed by external chaos. The court grew divided between those who clung to old loyalties and those who saw virtue in revision. Ministers weighed decisions carefully, aware that any misstep could bring catastrophe. Every treaty, every message, every military order felt like a stone balanced on a blade. Yet even as the political landscape darkened, the land itself began to heal. Years of relative peace allowed farmers to reclaim fields. Rice paddies shimmered again under clear summer skies. Forests began to recover where shipbuilding had once stripped them bare. Merchants returned to trade routes. Children played in markets without understanding the turmoil that shaped their parents' cautious expressions. In northern fortresses, soldiers trained with renewed determination. Drills echoed through cold mornings. Archers practiced until their fingers cracked. Horsemen rode along frozen rivers, leaving tracks that resembled the script of an uncertain future. Chue Yong inspected each troop with the same solemnity he had shown decades earlier. Yiseong-gye rode the frontier with scouts, learning every bend in the rivers and every ridge that shaped the land. Late in the decade, the first formal envoys from the Ming dynasty arrived. Their clothing bore different symbols, their speech carried different cadences, and their presence announced a truth that could no longer be ignored. A new power had risen where the old one crumbled. The peninsula stood between fading authority and emerging strength, needing to choose a direction without stepping too quickly. In quiet corners of the palace, ministers lit candles at dusk and placed their palms against the floor as if feeling for tremors. In temples, monks struck bells with careful strength, letting each note linger as a prayer for clarity. Across the land, people sensed that the long era of submission was ending, not abruptly, not triumphantly, but with the slow retreat of a tide that had dominated their shores for generations. What would replace it was still mist on the horizon. But Goryeo had endured worse than uncertainty, and its next chapter was already gathering in the footsteps of men who walked the frontier, watching the northern sky for signs of a world being reborn. Snow settled lightly over the northern passes when the final envoys of the Yuan crossed into the peninsula. Their horses were thin, their banners patched, and their faces tight with the strain of a journey undertaken through lands where the empire no longer commanded obedience. They appeared in Kaezong like ghosts of a fading world, carrying scrolls inked with decrees that no longer frightened anyone who read them. Their arrival marked not authority but decline, a quiet acknowledgement that the tide of history was turning. Kaezong received them with the same courtesy as always, though everyone in the palace felt the difference. In past years, the court had bowed out of fear. Now it bowed out of habit. When the envoys departed, few watched their procession. The streets that once lined with citizens eager or anxious to glimpse imperial representatives now barely stirred. The empire's shadow had thinned. What remained was a long, cold dusk stretching toward its end. As the empire above waned, a new force surged across the continent. The Ming dynasty, young but formidable, moved like a river gathering tributaries. Reports of their victories reached Goryeo through traders, monks, refugees, anyone who traveled near the mainland's shifting frontiers. Their armies pushed through northern territories the Yuan could no longer hold. Their leaders sent messages praising righteousness and order. Their rise reminded the peninsula of cycles older than any dynasty. Nothing on earth remained unchallenged for long. In Kaezong, this transformation ignited debates sharper than any that had filled the audience hall in decades. Ministers loyal to the old order urged caution, insisting that the empire's collapse might reverse, that loyalty would be rewarded. Others saw no sense in tethering the kingdom to a falling star. They argued that survival demanded adaptability, and if the Ming represented the next center of power, Goryeo must find a way to stand near its light, not beneath its shadow. The argument split the court, though not evenly. Younger officials looked to the future. Older nobles clung to what they understood. Generals who had fought for the realm in its darkest hours judged the situation with the coolness of men who measured consequences before ideals. Among them, two figures shaped the kingdom's fate more profoundly than anyone else: Goryeo-Yuan and Yi Seong-gye. Goryeo-Yuan remained steadfast. He had served Goryeo since youth, defending it through famine, invasion, and imperial dominance. His loyalty was not to kings or courts, but to the idea of a stable, united peninsula. He believed the Ming rise was a temporary awakening, and that old alliances, however strained, should not be broken lightly. Yi Seong-gye stood upon the same foundation, but saw further ahead. Years on the frontier had sharpened his instincts. He recognized that the Ming's discipline and momentum could not be dismissed. The landscape of power had shifted. Clinging to the past, he warned, would drag the kingdom into a conflict it could not afford. Their differences began as murmurs behind closed doors. Soon, they became the hinge of Goryeo's destiny. In the early months of 1388, the debate erupted into a crisis. News arrived that a Ming frontier official had occupied a stretch of land near the Yalu, claiming it as part of the emerging order. Ministers loyal to the declining empire demanded retaliation. They urged the king to send an army northward to drive the Ming forces out and reaffirm loyalty to the Yuan, even though the Yuan's influence had all but dissolved into memory. Goryeo-Yuan supported the punitive expedition. Honor required response, he argued. Territory lost without resistance would invite contempt. Stability depended on showing that Goryeo still possessed the resolve to act. Yi Seong-gye disagreed. To strike against the Ming was to invite ruin. Their armies were disciplined, numerous, and riding the crest of victory after victory. Goryeo's troops were tired, its treasury strained, its people weakened. War against the rising dynasty would not restore sovereignty. It would destroy what remained. Yet despite his protest, the king declared that the army would march. The decision shook the court. Some whispered that the monarch had been pressured by advisors who feared losing influence once the Ming solidified power. Others believed pride had blinded judgment. Whatever the cause, the order stood. Yi Seong-gye, despite his warnings, was appointed commander of the northern campaign. He accepted with a bowed head. But in the chambers where strategy was debated, he spoke plainly to Goryeo-Yuan. "If I march north," he said, "my men will die. The realm will bleed, and the Ming will not forget." Goryeo-Yuan met his gaze without wavering. "A kingdom that will not defend its borders," he answered, "cannot call itself a kingdom." There were truths in both statements, but time would reveal which one could preserve the peninsula. The army gathered at Weihua Island, a quiet place on the river where reeds trembled under the touch of early summer wind. Soldiers pitched tents along the banks, their campfires reflecting on water that moved with deceptive calm. They looked to their commander for guidance. Yi Seong-gye walked among them, speaking little, noting the exhaustion in their faces, the same exhaustion he had seen in decades of campaigns fought under foreign banners. As night fell, he stood at the river's edge, watching the stars flicker across the surface. Behind him, his officers gathered. Their expressions held the same unspoken thought. This campaign would not preserve the realm. It would bury it. Yi did not raise his voice. He simply said what each of them already knew. "A king's command can ruin a kingdom," he told them, "but a commander's decision can save it." At Weihua Island, he chose the future. He ordered the army to turn back, not toward the northern frontier, but toward the capital. The march southward unfolded with eerie calm. Villagers along the road, seeing the banners approach, expected news of war. Instead, they watched the soldiers move in disciplined silence, eyes forward, steps steady, a tide reversing its course. Chue-Yong heard of the turn long before the army reached Kaesong. He understood immediately what it meant. Goryeo was shifting under his feet. Loyalty alone could not hold together a kingdom collapsing from within and without. Yiseong-Gae entered the capital without bloodshed. Support flowed toward him as if drawn by gravity. Ministers who had hesitated for years now found their voices. Officials who had feared the empire more than their own king now spoke freely. The people, who had carried the burden of every generation's mistakes, saw in him the possibility of a new beginning. Chue-Yong was arrested. His long years of service did not shield him. When the sentence was carried out, he met death with the composure of a man who had never once feared it. His final words were recorded by a clerk whose hand shook even as he wrote, "I served the realm. That is enough." With Chue-Yong gone, the old order cracked like dry wood. The kingdom did not transform overnight. Yiseong-Gae moved cautiously, aware that legitimacy rested not in victory alone, but in the support of the scholars, the aristocracy, and the people. He reorganized military command, placed trusted officers along the frontiers, and reopened diplomatic channels with the Ming. Their envoys arrived in Kaesong, bearing messages written with careful courtesy. They recognized Yi's authority and praised his restraint. Such acknowledgement strengthened his standing more than any battle could. He then addressed the court. Ministers gathered in the hall, the air thick with apprehension. Yi spoke of renewal, stability, and the need for a dynasty that could guide the peninsula without relying on foreign shadows. His voice remained calm, but its clarity cut through decades of confusion. When he finished, silence filled the chamber, a silence that felt like a doorway opening. In 1392, the final decision was made. The Goryeo dynasty, weathered by centuries, bowed out of history. Yiseong-Gae ascended as the founder of a new order, the Joseon dynasty. Palace artisans carved new emblems. Scribes recorded the proclamation with solemn strokes. Bells rang out from temples across the land. Farmers paused in their fields. Merchants stopped mid-transaction. Elders wept quietly, unsure whether from grief or hope. A new kingdom had been born, not through conquest, not through rebellion alone, but through a turning of judgment at the precise moment history allowed. As Joseon's first dawn broke over the capital, the sky glowed with colors that seemed impossibly soft after decades of turmoil. Streets filled with murmurs of curiosity. Monks lit incense for a peaceful reign. Children chased each other in the courtyards of rebuilt homes. The southern coast, once dominated by shipyards serving a foreign empire, returned gradually to its rhythms of fishing and trade. The Falcon of the empire had faltered. A new standard rose in its place, and in the quiet of that transitional morning, the peninsula felt, for the first time in generations, the fragile promise of direction shaped by its own hands. Spring washed across the southern coast in soft colors when the first foreign sails appeared. Fishermen pulling in morning nets froze mid-motion as dark hulls emerged from the mist, so many that the sea itself seemed reshaped by their arrival. Waves broke against prows painted with emblems unfamiliar to the peninsula. Drums echoed across the water. And before the villages beneath the cliffs could react, the horizon filled with the iron-plated fleet of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Rumors had preceded this moment. Rumors of an ambitious warlord who had unified the fractured islands across the sea. Rumors of armies drilled in new formations. rumors of a man who believed the world must open before his ambition. Yet no one in the peninsula could have imagined a sight like this. A navy packed so densely that gulls circled overhead in confusion, torn between instinct and awe. At Busan, defenders watched the dark shapes draw nearer. Among them stood General Zhong Bao, a seasoned commander who had spent years petitioning the court for better fortifications, more muskets, and proper training. His warnings had been polite, persistent, and mostly ignored. Now, as he looked upon the approaching armada, he understood that the cost of neglect had finally arrived. The first cannon shot cracked the sky before dawn. Smoke billowed across the harbour. The walls trembled. Within minutes, arquebusiers aboard Japanese ships unleashed volleys that struck with the force of thunderclaps. Ash rained on the city like a second sunrise. Zhong Bao ordered the gates barred and the defenders to hold their ground, but the assault was overwhelming. When the invaders landed, they advanced with brutal coordination. Shields raised, muskets steady, blades gleaming. The clash at Busan lasted only hours, ending with flames rising from streets where only a day earlier, market vendors had arranged baskets of fish and rice. From Busan, the tide of war rolled northward with astonishing speed. Dongnai felt it next. Civilians fled in all directions, clutching children and bundles of whatever they could carry. Governor Song Sang-hyun refused evacuation. He stood upon the ramparts in armor left from his father's generation, facing muskets that shattered stone with each blast. His refusal to surrender became a small beacon of honor in a campaign defined by shock. Yet he fell beneath a storm of bullets, and Dongnai followed Busan into ruin. Within days, the invaders surged inland, sweeping through villages that had no warning beyond the echo of gunfire. Messengers galloped toward Hanseong, breathless and mud-splattered, bearing reports that the king struggled to believe. Roads filled with refugees. Temples opened their gates to those fleeing the burning coast. Farmers abandoned fields full of spring shoots, knowing they would lose harvest and home alike. The court gathered in emergency session as the map darkened with markers of defeat. Ministers spoke over one another, fear sharpening their voices. Some urged immediate negotiation. Others demanded counterattacks the kingdom was not prepared to mount. The king listened with a face drained of color. As troops fell back from one town after another, he made a decision that had been unthinkable only a week earlier. The royal household would evacuate the capital. Hanseong erupted into chaos. Ox carts loaded with scrolls, regalia, and sacred tablets rolled through the palace gates. Soldiers ushered courtiers through alleys where citizens watched in disbelief. Rumors spread faster than orders. The capital might fall, the enemy unstoppable. Those who could fled northward, dragging carts through muddy fields. Those who could not remained behind, clutching hope with trembling hands. As the court moved toward Pyongyang, something quiet but resolute stirred across the peninsula. Nobles who had once lived cushioned lives felt the shock of invasion as deeply as common laborers. Monks left their temples, organizing bands of laypeople into irregular forces armed with farming tools, old swords, and borrowed muskets. Peasants who had endured decades of hardship now rose with unexpected courage. These righteous armies, Wibeong, righteous fighters, formed not by decree but by necessity. They struck from forests. They ambushed supply lines. Their numbers grew daily. Yet it was at sea that the kingdom's most remarkable defense took shape. Along the southern coast, Admiral Yi Zunxin prepared for a war he had foreseen long before the first shot was fired. His naval yards had worked quietly for years under his direction, strengthening hulls, improving armor. and drilling rowers until they moved like a single breath. The admiral read the currents with the precision of a seasoned astronomer and anticipated enemy routes through instinct honed by decades. When news of Busan reached him, Yi-sun-sin summoned his officers without raising his voice. He issued orders with the clarity of someone who had already envisioned the coming battles. His fleet assembled under skies streaked with the colors of dusk, the sound of oars carrying across waters that seemed suddenly colder. The first engagement unfolded near Okpo. Japanese vessels, still swollen with victory and supplies, had anchored carelessly along a sheltered coast. Yi's ships approached in disciplined formation, their oars silent until the final moment. When he signaled the attack, arrows and cannon fire struck with such precision that enemy ships burst into flame before they could even turn. The sea turned into a field of ash and splintered wood. Yi recorded the victory with characteristic restraint, noting only that the enemy had been checked, but the campaign had only begun. Reports of his triumph traveled quickly, lifting morale across regions battered by defeat. Farmers who had abandoned their fields cheered when word reached them that Japanese supply lines had been severed. Villagers hiding in forest shelters found renewed strength. Monks struck temple bells in celebration. For the first time since the invasion began, hope took tangible form. A fleet, a commander, and a path toward resistance. Yi-sun-sin knew better than to celebrate prematurely. He directed his fleet along the southern archipelagos, steering through treacherous currents using knowledge passed down among fishermen. His ships descended upon enemy transports with relentless efficiency. More victories followed, at Hapo, at Jokjinpo, at Dangpo. Each one chipped away at the invaders' momentum, though the land remained in turmoil. Meanwhile, the Japanese advanced along the main roads toward Hanseong. Their vanguard reached the capital only days after the royal court fled. They found the gates open, the palace emptied, and the city silent, except for the wind rattling unshuttered windows. Occupation forces moved in, establishing command posts in buildings where kings had once held court. Yet even with the capital under their control, their supply lines strained. Yi's fleet had carved a hunger into their campaign. Far inland, righteous armies continued to rise. One group sheltered in a ruined fortress near Jeolla, gathering men under banners sewn from monks' robes. Another formed on a hillside, where rice farmers armed themselves with bamboo spears sharpened by fire. These groups lacked training, but possessed unyielding resolve. They disrupted communications, captured scouts, and harassed the rear of the advancing army. Although they could not halt the invasion, they splintered its cohesion. The court, now in Pyongyang, sent urgent pleas for assistance across the border. When the letters reached the Ming court, they were carried by trembling hands, but delivered with steady voices. The Ming emperor listened. He recognized not only the desperation in the appeals, but also the geopolitical risk of allowing a foreign power to dominate the peninsula. A decision was made. Troops would assemble. As the summer deepened, Japanese commanders faced a reality that contradicted their expectations. Victories on land did not guarantee success. Their armies were stretched thin across unfamiliar territory. Food became scarce. Communications faltered. And the sea, meant to be their lifeline, had turned hostile under Yi-sun-sin's watch. Rumors of the admiral's next decisive engagement circulated weeks before it occurred. Soldiers spoke of a formation so devastating it resembled the sweep of a divine fan. But no rumor matched the spectacle itself at Hansen Island, where Yi-sun-sin deployed his fleet in a maneuver later known as the Crane Wing. His ships curved outward like unfolding feathers, trapping the enemy in a tightening arc. Cannon blasts reverberated across the water. Japanese ships found themselves boxed in, unable to turn or flee. The sea roared with fire and splintered masts. This victory shifted the balance of the entire war. On land, Japanese generals argued over strategy. Some pushed toward the northern routes, hoping to capture the court before Ming aid arrived. Others urged consolidation. Yet every decision now carried consequences shaped by a war they no longer controlled alone. In the villages scattered across the peninsula, people began to understand that the invaders, once seemingly unstoppable, could be resisted. New righteous armies formed under leaders whose names traveled by word of mouth. Scholars turned commanders, monks who exchanged prayer beads for bows, farmers driven by loss. Still, the devastation was immense. Entire towns emptied. Crops withered as fields when untended. Roads once busy with traders now carried only refugees. Even the air tasted of smoke and uncertainty. Yet through all this, a pattern emerged, uneven, fragile, but unmistakable. The kingdom was no longer collapsing. It was beginning to hold. Ye Sun Xin's victories carried the weight of turning tides. The Ming response loomed just beyond the horizon, and among the ashes of the early campaign, a resilience older than dynasties resurfaced across the peninsula. Hope returned, not as triumph, but as endurance. What followed would determine whether that endurance could transform into survival. Winter pressed itself into the valleys, with quiet determination, settling over ruins left by the first terrible year of invasion. Frost clung to shattered timbers and charred roof tiles, softening the outlines of devastation without changing its substance. Where roads had once echoed with merchants' calls, only the creak of frozen branches remained. The Japanese army, which had surged northward like a rising tide, now moved with slower rhythm, its early momentum dulled by the burden of occupying a land that resisted with every ridge, every forest, every stretch of river. Into this bleak landscape came rumors that carried a force greater than any weapon. Travelers whispered of an army assembling beyond the northern frontier, Ming battalions marching in columns that stretched for miles, their armor shining beneath cold sun. Refugees from border villages spoke of scouts riding ahead of vast contingents, of supply trains rattling toward the peninsula. Even Japanese detachments felt the shift. Their scouts returned from the northern passes, with reports that chilled the confidence which had once defined the invasion. In Hanseong, where Japanese commanders had taken residence in the palace, maps lay unrolled across floors, scarred by months of occupation. Officers paced between lanterns that flickered in the draught of broken windows, debating how to confront an enemy far larger than anything they had faced so far. The capital, emptied of its king and royal family, held its breath. Smoke from distant skirmishes drifted into the courtyards, a reminder that the land itself had begun to stir against its occupiers. Across the countryside, righteous armies swelled like a storm gathering in secret. Their members came from every corner of the realm, monks who left temple bells behind to carry bows, scholars whose calm handwriting now recorded supply logs, farmers who sharpened bamboo into spears. They moved through mountain passes in long, quiet lines and struck with surprising coordination. Supply wagons vanished. Army patrols were ambushed on roads thought secure. The invaders searched for a central command that did not exist. The peninsula's strength was its ability to rise everywhere at once. When the Ming vanguard reached the border, their approach felt like a gate opening onto a new world. rows upon rows of infantry advanced with measured steps, their banners rippling in winter wind. Drums carried across frozen fields, announcing their arrival to villages that had prayed for this moment for months. Goryeo soldiers, hardened by a year of disaster, marched beside them with renewed purpose. The first major clash between Ming and Japanese forces unfolded in a blaze of gunfire and smoke. Steel rang against steel. The ground trembled beneath the weight of cavalry. By dusk, the invaders had lost ground they could not easily reclaim. As Ming forces pushed south, the invaders began retreating from positions that had seemed unshakable. Villages along the roads saw the changes immediately. Where Japanese troops had marched in rigid formation, ragged lines now passed. Men exhausted, armor dented, horses thin. Officers shouted commands that were swallowed by wind. Local guerrillas emerged from behind stone walls to reclaim fields that had not been touched since spring. Yet the war's center of gravity did not lie solely in these land battles. It shifted constantly toward the sea. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, reinstated after early triumphs, continued to command a navy that had become the kingdom's lifeline. His fleet moved like a single organism along the southern archipelagos, striking where the enemy least expected. Victories mounted: Hapo, Dangpo, Sacheon. Each battle tightened the noose around the invaders' supply routes, cutting into the heart of their campaign. Then came the moment that nearly broke everything. Political intrigue in the court reached Yi Sun-sin in the middle of the war. Orders arrived relieving him of his command. No explanation, no appeal. Yi obeyed as bound by duty, stepping aside without protest. The fleet, which had followed him with unwavering faith, passed to a new admiral, anxious to distinguish himself. Within weeks, disaster struck. The navy sailed into an ill-planned engagement at Chilchonriang and was destroyed almost entirely. Flames lit the sea from horizon to horizon. Survivors washed ashore with tales of chaos and despair. The news struck the peninsula with the force of a blow. People who had clung to Yi's victories as symbols of hope now found themselves staring into an abyss. Soldiers cursed the decision that had removed him. Monks whispered prayers in temple courtyards that smelled of smoke. Even the Ming commanders, who had grown accustomed to coordinating strategy with Ye's steady leadership, sent inquiries to understand what madness had unfolded. Realizing the full severity of their mistake, court officials reinstated Yi Sun-sin immediately. He returned not in triumph, but in quiet determination, wearing armor dulled by months away from the front. The fleet he found was a ghost of its former self. Barely a dozen seaworthy ships remained. Yet the admiral walked the docks with unshaken composure. He inspected hulls, spoke with craftsmen, and called the surviving officers together. As word spread that he had said, "If I have one ship, I have a fleet," the mood of the entire coastline changed. Hope did not erase fear, but it pushed back against resignation. Yi's restored navy moved into action just as the invaders attempted their second great push north. The Japanese forces had regrouped, reinforced, and launched a new campaign with grim resolve. Towns burned again. Fortresses that had just been repaired fell into siege once more. Families evacuated with practiced speed, their belongings packed before the smoke reached the hills. Goryeo troops retreated through narrow passes, holding ground where they could and falling back where they must. It was during these months of renewed struggle that Yi Sun-sin turned to the Myeongyang Strait. The narrow channel roared with currents as unpredictable as any in the peninsula. Where other commanders saw danger, Yi saw opportunity. His dozen ships waited in formation, hidden by fog and the strait's twisting sound. When the Japanese fleet, 100 ships strong, surged forward. The admiral steered his flagship into the current with flawless timing. The enemy pressed in, confident and overwhelming. Only when they were caught in the violent turbulence did Yi order the attack. The sea itself became his ally. Japanese ships spun out of control, colliding with one another. Cannon fire burst from Yi's lines. Arrows rained down from decks steady enough to exploit every shift in the current. By battle's end, the strait was choked with wreckage. What should have been victory for the invaders became catastrophe. And once more, the peninsula learned that the sea would answer to this commander alone. The victory transformed the war. Ming commanders pushed harder. Goryeo militias surged with new vigor. Japanese morale faltered. Retreat became an accepted reality even among their highest ranks. They withdrew toward the southern coast, fortifying strongholds where ships could still reach them, assuming the sea allowed passage at all. Through this tightening grip, the invaders awaited word from their lord. It came not as command, but as finality. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was dead. His generals read the announcement in heavy silence. The dream that had carried them across the sea dissolved into necessity. Japan needed its soldiers home. Yet retreat required protection, and Yi Sun-sin understood that the final blow of the war would fall on the waves. As Japanese fleets gathered for evacuation, Ai's combined forces, Goryeo and Ming, moved to intercept. The strait at Noryang glittered beneath the cold stars when the two navies took their positions. Lanterns flickered across decks. Officers exchanged last instructions. The sea swelled with the tension of impending battle. At dawn, the fight erupted. Cannon blasts shook the air. The clash of iron rippled across the water. Japanese ships attempted to break through, but Yi, positioned at the heart of the fleet, steered his flagship with a precision that turned chaos into opportunity. His vessel cut through enemy lines, drawing fire so his allies could strike. Arrows hissed past him. Splinters burst from the rails. He remained at his post, issuing commands with steady voice until a stray shot found him. Even then, he spoke calmly, ordering his officers not to reveal his death until the battle was won. They obeyed with trembling discipline. Only after the last enemy ship fled did they lower the admiral's body onto the deck. When word spread across the peninsula, grief rose as tangibly as smoke. Fishermen bowed to the waves. Monks lit lanterns that floated down rivers, like stars returning to the sea. Families spoke his name with reverence, not in triumph, but in gratitude. Yi Sun-sin had given the realm its future. The war's end arrived quietly. Japanese forces departed with the tide. Ming battalions marched homeward. Goryeo's court returned to a palace still bearing scars of occupation. Farmers reclaimed fields littered with shattered weapons. Children played among ruins that would soon be rebuilt. Markets slowly reopened. The peninsula exhaled for the first time in years. Peace felt fragile, but it was real. Villages laid the dead to rest. Temples restored their bells. Survivors of righteous armies returned to farms. Their bamboo spears burned as offerings instead of wielded as weapons. Families who had fled into mountains returned to the valleys, starting anew with hands calloused by hardship. The war had stolen harvests, homes, and generations, but it had not taken the heart of the peninsula. That heart, weathered and relentless, beat still, carrying the realm into a future shaped not by conquest, but by the survivors who rebuilt it, lamp by lamp, field by field, breath by breath.